Welcome, everyone. I appreciate the chance to join you today, though I'm sorry that we're coming together in such an awful, heartbreaking moment. At times like this, words do little to ease the pain, but as UCLA's chancellor and simply as an individual, I want to say to all of our Asian American, and Pacific Islander Bruins, we care deeply about your safety, your well-being, and we recognize the grief, anger, and exasperation you're feeling. This week's terrible attacks, which led to the deaths of 7 women and 1 man, 6 of whom were women of Asian descent, took place amidst rising xenophobia fueled by unjust resentment and scapegoating related to COVID-19. But we also know that this goes back much further, to the murder of Vincent Chen, to the internment camps during Japanese Americans during World War II, to the laws against Asian immigration, to a history of casting Asians and Pacific Islanders as the perpetual other, instead of recognizing their individuality, dignity, and humanity of each person and respecting that person's heritage. At times, this history can feel overwhelming, but we must hold on to the hope that what we do at UCLA matters. We endeavor to build a community with shared commitment to equity, diversity, and inclusion. We bring people of all backgrounds together to learn and collaborate with one another. We study vexing social issues and we work towards solutions. Most critically, we show compassion for one another in times of distress. All of these are statements about a better world we want to create and about our commitment to creating it. In my message about anti-Asian hate last month, I quoted the late Chinese American civil rights activist Grace Lee Boggs, who once said that the only way to survive is by taking care of one another. She was exactly right. And we need to hear her in this moment. Take care of one another is the only way going forward. It's the only way that we'll progress as a community. And we must all remember that on this sad day and what I hope are better days to come. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I want to join Chancellor Block in thanking you all for gathering tonight. We gather to decry this horrific violence and the hatred and racism taking place right now, targeting people for being Asian, Asian American, and Pacific Islander, and in many cases for being women. For everyone here, especially students, I want to acknowledge the pain and that this hatred causes, the fear it creates about what might be next, and the toll it takes during an already exhausting time. The entire Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion team and I are here to support. We have resources available on our website, and we'll be hosting an event to hold space in early April. We know that in times like these, we need to come together as a community, and I am very grateful to be here with you this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chancellor Block and Vice Chancellor Bradley. We really appreciate your presence and your support. And before I bring up our main speakers, we are a university, and at the core of the university is our student population. And I wanted to highlight the voices of 2 of our undergraduate students, and we welcome them to join us to share their reflections and how they're coping and handling and what wisdom they have for us. And I hope we can learn from them as much as we're really looking forward to them sharing their experience. And so without further ado, I want to bring to the stage Tiffany Do. Tiffany is a sociology major, a member of the class of 2021, and she has been quite active in various programs on campus to advocate for Vietnamese American students. And I'm just very happy Tiffany's here to join us. Tiffany, would you mind sharing a few words?
Yes, thank you for having me, Professor Michael Berry. Thank you for everyone that has organized this event, and for everyone here who are joining us in this very important discussion that we're having. I wanted to share my perspective as a student and how I support my community as an individual and also a person that is involved with various Southeast Asian organization spaces. And I think for me, the main thing that I am very proud of is the power of students coming together to uplift our communities. And some of the things that I've been involved with this past year is I was a staff member for the Southeast Asian Students for Organizing Conference, which is the second, this year was our second conference that we held, and that was all led by students. And the amazing thing this year is that it was a variety of students coming together from all over the country, not just at UCLA and not just Southeast Asian students. And it was a power of the students coming together to really create a space to talk about how we can really support our communities and also have cross-community solidarity, not just with the Southeast Asian community, but also with the Black community, Indigenous community, and Latinx community. So that has been very uplifting for me personally, being a part of that. And another big part of my student experience has been being a CCLEAR staff member, CCLEAR being the Southeast Asian Retention Project, which is a student-led project at UCLA that has been a really big source of my community, and also a way that I have been supporting students throughout this pandemic, but especially during this time with all of the rise with the Asian hate crimes and all of the things that we're dealing with as students. So for me, I don't really see myself as being just a student. Like that at this time really is not the most important thing. And I think it's more important for me to be together with other students and continue to uplift our communities in different ways that we can, whether that's holding events for one another, having conversations with one another, with our peers, with our like professors. Like I had the opportunity of talking to Thu-Huong and also with other scholars as well. That has been very helpful for me. And I think my goal with all of that has just been to create a safe space to process our emotions, to brainstorm actions to support one another in our communities, and also just provide a connection with another human being, whether we have similar experiences and perspectives or not. I think it's really important, especially during this time, to connect with one another and just continue to talk about how we can continue to just fight the oppression that we face. And I think the main takeaways that I wanted to leave with y'all is that for me, it's very comforting to know that there are many others who seek the same goals of liberation and have had the experiences and the history of planting the seed before me. And also there are people who are continuing to fight for our communities now, and there will be people who continue to fight for us following my generation. I also wanted to acknowledge that violence doesn't just come in the form of personal violence, such as hate crimes, but it's embedded in our culture and our structure through microaggressions, systemic racism, deportation, mass incarceration, war on our communities, both in the States and overseas, and just overall barriers to resources. So while we focus on the hate crimes that have been arising, we also need to acknowledge the history of violence that continues to oppress our communities as we continue to have these conversations and continue to fight against that. And another conversation that I recently had with Thu-Huong that I wanted to say is that what is very motivational for me is just focusing on building relationships to support one another, because that's what I think has been helping me and what can help everyone else, especially our community as a whole. And overall, every single day, what I'm trying to do is just be open to change and open to growth, knowing that this isn't an issue that I can simply resolve on my own, but this is something I have to work towards throughout the rest of my life. And as intimidating as that sounds, it's also very comforting to know that this is something that I'm not just doing alone, and that I have the rest of my community to back up me. So thank you for the space, for sharing my thoughts, and I wish the best to all of you.
Thank you, Tiffany. Our next speaker is another UCLA undergraduate, Mariana Schroede, who is a sociology major, class of 2021. She is also the managing editor of the Journal of World Affairs, and her work exhibits her passion for such topics as race, gender, mental health, and homelessness, as well as the intersection of those areas. So Mariana.
Yeah, I have a little bit of background noise that just started, but I'll try to speak loudly. But I wanted to start off just by thanking you, Professor Berry, for allowing me to be a part of this event and for taking in that feedback from a student and organizing this to happen. And for Professor Nguyen-Vo too, for inviting me to come and speak and be a part of this very important conversation. And I'm also really happy too to meet some of you too with fellow members of the Asian American community and dedicated scholars and activists. And thank you so much to Chancellor Block and Vice Chancellor Bradley for being here too and taking the time to listen. I also want to preface my comments just by saying that I'll be relying a lot more on my notes than I'd like to, just because it's the last, not just this most recent hate crime, but just this past over a month in general has just been very emotionally difficult for me and traumatic to get through. So I'm going to be relying on my notes just so I can say everything I want to get said. So just a little bit on my background and perspective. So I think I can offer a little bit of a unique perspective being half white and half Vietnamese. So my grandpa, my mom's family was from South Vietnam, and my grandpa, my mom's dad, was working with the CIA from there and facing death threats. So they had to come here during the first wave of Vietnamese refugees in 1975. So, and then my dad was born here in Orange, California, where I live in Orange County. So kind of having that unique perspective of a hybrid identity and not really being completely white or completely Asian has kind of given me an opportunity to navigate different binary spaces and kind of operate between them too. And kind of from that background of being white and Asian, I've had people mock my Vietnamese middle name Hunt, which I rarely say because I get so traumatized over the comments I've endured from both other students and staff over my Vietnamese name. And just comments too from even teachers and friends about having almond-shaped eyes or having narrow features, which I am lucky as a white person and having a white name that I don't have to worry as much about being subject to a verbal or physical attack as maybe other members of my community that have more Asian predominant features. But then it also is a double-edged sword because it comes with a lot of racist and harmful comments that I've had to endure in both my K through 12 and post-secondary experience because of how people will feel comfortable saying things that they wouldn't say if they knew there was an Asian in the room. And I feel like it's kind of allowed me to operate undercover in a way that I hear a lot of comments that I maybe otherwise wouldn't hear if I weren't white or at least racially ambiguous passing. So some of these are just fetishizing Asian women and desexualizing Asian men, showing how deeply ingrained these Asian stereotypes are in US society and in casual conversation. One of the most disturbing ones to me happened in Orange County when I was meeting a friend of a friend, and this was a white family, and they had Chinese neighbors that lived next door, and they just casually made a joking comment that their neighbors have dogs for dinner every night. And it wasn't until one of my friends said for me that I was Vietnamese that they apologized for what they said, because I was just at such a loss for words at how it just revealed how people can really say insidious, harmful things when they don't know who they're actually talking to. So this rhetoric may seem trivial or harmless, like about eating dogs or about sexualizing women, but it has really real physical consequences I think we've all seen. And when you other people and project these overgeneralizations onto them, it makes it also easier to dehumanize them and to turn them into an archetype and to see them as a foreign abstract idea, so that when they do face this violence, racism, and discrimination, it's easy to turn a blind eye or to say, well, I don't get it. I thought all Asians do well and all Asians are successful. So I feel like these stereotypes kind of allow this to happen. Also, these hate crimes, including the most recent one where we saw the tragic killing of 6 Asian women, highlighted to the intersection between racial and gender violence and how these complex issues intersect with one another, and including in this specific case, the hypersexualization of Asian women by white men. And while the recent spotlight on this issue might make them seem novel or shocking, anti-Asian violence, kind of like Tiffany was saying, it goes really far back, and it's not as recent as just a few weeks ago or this past week with the shooting. And just a few of many examples of that I've myself been able to educate myself on in the last month. where the Chinese massacre of 1871 in LA, which is actually described by multiple sources as the largest last lynching in American history, despite the fact that I hadn't even heard of this event until 5 weeks ago, let alone knowing it was the largest mass lynching right here in LA. Also the Chinese Exclusion Act and Japanese internment, which are the two examples that I hear kind of get cited as when they're two of very many. The Rock Springs Massacre, Tacoma riot, sexual enslavement of Asian women and girls, which is not historical, continues to happen. Hell's Canyon Massacre of 1887, and court cases with institutional racism, including US versus Wong Kim Ark, Lum versus Rice, Lau versus Nichols, and the recent deportation just this past week of 33 Vietnamese families who were separated by an administration that ran on the platform that they were looking out for the Asian community and people of color, but separated 33 families during a pandemic. And many of them had been here since before the 1980s. They weren't new, they were American. So I'm gonna modestly offer just some of my ideas for some steps to take forward and moving up. And I think some of that is advocacy and community engagement through the forms of just critically evaluating the way that communities, including the Asian American community, are depicted in national discourse and in the media, being both issues like scapegoating an entire race for a pandemic, or even just the way that Asians are depicted in film or TV, and kind of something that you wouldn't think to critically analyze. I think it's important to look very critically and see what kind of stereotypes those representations perpetuate, rather than being dynamic or complex characters. I also think discussing these issues in various circles and communities consistently and ongoing with a plan of action, rather than letting this be a brief moment of outrage or social media moment, is a really good way to start to keep the momentum going. I think this can also be done through multiple formats, not necessarily just speeches or social media, but also film and music, artistic formats, poetry, which we actually got to do in Professor Nguyen-Vo's class for the Vietnamese American experience. And my group got to make a zine about anti-Asian hate crimes and Asian American news. And I think a lot of, besides the fact that that project was shareable, which I really appreciate, and I was able to share it with some of my friends and have conversations outside of the classroom on it, I think it was also important that it didn't just paint Asian people as victims or pity Asian Americans, but also uplift them in a way that genuinely shows the community, rather than just pointing to them as an example of somebody who made it. I also think for students specifically, for UCLA students, I would highly recommend taking courses in the Asian American department and other ethnic studies departments, especially just from my experience in the cultural classes I've taken, including the Vietnamese American experience. It just really gave me a sense of pride to be Vietnamese American and Asian American. And it was, I said the first day of that class, that was the first time that I had more than one or two Asian classmates or Vietnamese classmates specifically in a class, which was just a really big wake-up call for me. So I think that's a really good way to start as a student specifically. And I think also, like Tiffany said, just showing solidarity with the Asian American community, but also with other communities of color within that. So I'm really looking forward to hearing everyone's insights on this topic and learning from you too.
Thank you so much, Mariana and Tiffany. Especially, I'm grateful for all of the insights and kind of proactive information that you put out there for us. And I just, like I said, part of what we're doing here today is to listen. And I think it's so important for all of us to listen to what our current students are experiencing and how they're navigating this current crisis. We're now going to move to our featured speakers, and my apologies that because of time limitations, I'm going to give very cursory introductions to everyone, but I encourage you to look at our event website for more detailed bios and the websites of the various speakers to learn more. Our first speaker is Professor Thu-Huong Nguyen-Vo, who is my beloved colleague in the Department of Asian Languages and Culture. She also holds an appointment in Asian American Studies. She is the author of such books as The Ironies of Freedom, Sex, Culture, and Neoliberal Governance in Vietnam, and Khmer-Viet Relations and the Third Indochina Conflict. And I also want to thank Thu-Huong because she is my colleague who brought our two student speakers to the table. I reached out to her and she very graciously recommended Mariana and Tiffany. So Thu-Huong, would you mind taking the stage?
Yeah, thank you so much, Michael, for organizing this event. As you said, you know, the need to organize this event is something that is cause for consternation and lament. And it is unfortunate that we have to come together to talk about this, but I really appreciate that we have this space so that I can learn from other, not just colleagues, but students as well, like perspectives from the younger generation, which I think is so important and so insightful. So thank you so much, Tiffany and Mariana, for enlightening us in terms of what your generation is doing, how you see the connections between formations that lead us to this point. And of course, thanks to everybody who is here today. And I look forward to having a conversation later on. I'm going to keep my remarks brief. A lot of the grounds have been covered by Tiffany and Mariana already. So, I'm going to try to give as much time as possible for us to talk about this in the, larger group later on. So I guess, needless to say, I was angry and sad and just could not sleep when the news came out about this. Because from the descriptions that later came out, the descriptions of the women who were killed didn't come out until much later. But once I read them, these women sound like the many women that I know from my community who try to make a living in jobs that leave them vulnerable. Some of these jobs are the result of capitalism and how it extracts profit out of the differences that it amplifies between kinds of people, whether you're Asian or Black, queer or straight men or women, or whether you call yourself a certain thing or present yourself in a certain way. It can shape whether you can access capital or not, be protected or not. But I want to, I guess my anger also stemmed from the kind of narratives that we kept hearing in the media, coming from the police, the Cherokee County Police, or the political leaders that got into the conversation. I felt like they weren't really addressing the sort of like fundamental or underlying issues, like this long history, for example, of constructing Asians as the outsider, and being the outsider also means that you can end up in a space of incarceration like Japanese Americans, right? So there's those two sort of like go hand in hand. So people are not really talking about that, or we're not talking about that. They were basically, talking about, this process of investigation and all that, but I'll address it in a minute. But I was like so angry. I feel like saying that, make no mistake, like if you are a white man making Asian women into sex objects, then kill them as the sources of your temptation. That's racist and misogynistic. Yet the legal procedural narrative allows the police and the political leaders to defer to processes that try to either separate racism from misogyny and recuperate the humanity of the white man over that of the Asian women that he killed. So I was thinking that, seeking legal redress through demands for police protection or legislation may help, but it would also reproduce the very same structure that separates the good from the bad people within racialized communities and can amplify the familiar police brutality against one or all of these groups or communities. So instead, I was thinking that we may need to sort of imagine together forms of restorative justice that address the inequality and vulnerability of folks in our communities in the first place. So we need more means to protect the most vulnerable within each community and create points of connection across racialized communities, making use of skill sets that have developed historically in each community to fight white supremacist narratives and institutions. We have a long way to go to dismantle some of these racist, misogynist, queer, transphobic cultural formations if we still hope for a better place in which to live. I know that some of the forms that we engage in have been performative And I think the performative is useful up a point, but if the performative replaces, whatever we can imagine that we do to address the more structural problems, the economic inequality, all of the racist institutions and, this long history that is at the heart of this core sickness of America, as someone had phrased it, racism in this way. So the performative is useful, but it should not replace how we might imagine addressing some of these structural issues. And I know that the talk today, it's organized by the Center for Chinese Studies, and I thank you for that, would sort of like also highlights the role or the discourse surrounding the rise of China, right? There's work to be done, not only in relation to the racist rhetorics from white supremacist quarters in this country, but also from within Asian communities as well. Like in the past year, I saw a kind of heightening of a realignment of groups transnationally, like the news sources and platforms supported by the Falun Gong group, for example. They have become like these foci of the dissemination of news across Asian communities here in this country, but also in Asia as well, particularly like, what I am familiar with is in Vietnam, which created a kind of realignment of politics where the critique of authoritarian in China, which might be very legitimate, all of a sudden becomes a kind of, aligned with white supremacy in the US, which makes the work within communities difficult in terms of, coordinating or disseminating ways of analyzing or ways of seeing where we would fit in this country. And, this has to do with this the realignment of competing nationalism, right, and geopolitics in the region in Asia. So while we're talking about, this this sickness that is racism in America, we also need to pay attention to how it connects to a very long history that was global and transnational in these ways as well, particularly at this contemporary moment where we sort of like see these process playing out in the Pacific and in the United States in these connecting ways. And I am just so heartened that we are able to come together today, and I look forward to listening to the rest of the panelists, but also to the participants today as well. I know that you have a lot more perspectives to offer, so I thank you for that.
Thank you, Thu-Huong. I appreciate your words. Our next speaker is Professor Claire Jean Kim from UC Irvine, where she is a professor of Asian American Studies and Political Science. She is also the author of Bitter Fruit, The Politics of Black Korean Conflict in New York City, and Dangerous Crossings, Race, Species, and Nature in a Multicultural Age, both of which have been awarded numerous book awards. Professor Kim?
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Berry, for organizing this event and giving us all a chance to come together and think together about recent events. Professor Nguyen-Vo, I just wanted to thank you for your points about capitalism, reinforcing carceral logics, and restorative justice. I hope we can come back and talk more about those, because I think those are incredibly important points and an important part of the story. So Asian American communities are frightened, angry, and distressed, and there has never been a more important time for us to try to understand anti-Asian violence, and we can do this by talking and learning from each other and trying to put the pieces together. So what is causing harassment and violence against Asian Americans, and what will it take to stop it? I'm finishing a book right now that I spent many years researching, entitled Asian Americans in an Anti-Black World, and I want to bring this research to bear in addressing these questions. Asian Americans have always been seen as not white, as not American, and perpetually foreign. This has remained true even as many Asian Americans assimilate into white society and attain economic, educational, and occupational mobility. When a crisis occurs, especially one that involves an Asian nation, So this could involve economic contraction, a trade war, or a pandemic. A wave of exclusionary actions arises, and we Asian Americans are reminded that we were only ever conditional citizens. So the aggression and distrust against Asian Americans are below the surface there, waiting to be triggered by external events. Although thankfully this has happened less frequently since the World War II era. The insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th reminds us that in the US, white nationalism is not a thing of the past or a fringe phenomenon, but white nationalism or the elevation of whiteness is only part of the picture. There's also anti-Blackness, the systemic abjection of Black people since slavery, as exemplified by the murder of George Floyd last May. The Black Lives Matter movement has spoken about the specificity of the status of Black people for almost a decade now. And I think it's critically important that we think about what anti-Asian violence means in the age of Black Lives Matter. That is, in the context of the anti-Black violence that has been continuous and unremitting, indeed structural, and incomparably severe for hundreds of years. By this, I do not mean how do we analogize or compare or describe as parallel what's happening with Asian Americans. Rather, how do we think what is happening with Asian Americans in relation to what happens with Black people? And this requires that we think about the positioning of different groups, how Asian Americans have always been not white, but also not Black, as I argue in my book, and how not Blackness has been a structural advantage that has permitted a kind of mobility to some Asian Americans that is denied to many Black people. So I want to note, I am not talking about a discursive story or myth being told about a model minority. I am talking about differential structural treatment. Black feminists have been telling us for generations, when Black people are free, all people will be free. It is only when those held at the bottom of society are free that all can be said to be liberated. This message has never been more relevant because it's not necessarily true that when Asian Americans are free, all people will be free. So this is the choice I think we face at this historic moment, at this turning point in US history, where we are in the aftermath of the largest Black-led racial justice movement this nation has ever seen. As a group advantaged by not Blackness, even as we are disadvantaged by not whiteness, we can seek protection for ourselves alone as Asian Americans within an anti-Black system. Or we can seek protection for everyone, including the worst off, by pursuing a structural transformation of society. We can focus on the hate that rises up against Asian Americans alone, or we can relate it to the hate that targets Black people relentlessly and brutally. Not just on the street and in public places, but in the cloistered space of the ICU, where Black people are dying from COVID-19 at staggering rates. So we have, as Asian Americans, I think, a historic role to play and an opportunity to play it. After the murder of George Floyd, I gave a lot of talks and interviews, and Asian Americans would come up to me, or well, they weren't physical talks, so they would approach me by Zoom and ask me, how can we be good allies to Black Lives Matter? So my answer is that it's now at moments like this, when we feel pain from our own losses, now is the most important time to try to be good allies. So my questions are, can we keep Black pain centered in our vision as Black Lives Matter asks us to do? Can we locate ourselves in relation to anti-Blackness and the Black freedom struggle? Can we resist the temptation to circle the wagons and take up the banner of Asian nationalisms and instead face outward with open minds and hearts? Can we change the slogan from Stop Asian Hate to transform this racist anti-Black society? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Our next speaker is Kaiser Guo, and Kaiser is the host and co-founder of the Sinica podcast, which is the most popular English language podcast on current affairs dealing with China. In an alternate life, he was the international communications director for Baidu, a Chinese internet company, and yet another previous life, he was a heavy metal guitar player in Tang Dynasty and Spring and Autumn, two popular rock bands in China. And I invited Kaiser because a few days ago on Clubhouse, he hosted a room about this topic and had some really wonderful insights. And I was hoping he might share some of those with us today. Kaiser?
Thank you so much, Michael, for, I am unmuted, yes, for organizing this excellent event. I want to talk about a dimension to these vicious hate crimes in Atlanta and to the whole year-long surge in anti-Asian violence that I think gets lost too often in the pained conversation, and that is the international dimension to this. This didn't happen only because of the ugly name-calling by Trump, though that undoubtedly had a very big part of it. It's not just another unspeakably awful year in a long, grim history of awful years of violence against Asian Americans. This is different. It has obvious parallels to the cruel and unjust internment of Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor, but we are not at war with China. It has parallels to the murder of Vincent Chin, but the anti-Japanese animus of the 1980s pales, as horrible as it was, by comparison to what we're seeing now with China. China's rapid rise has been perceived by a substantial portion of the American population as a threat. The US has in China really the first multi-dimensional peer competitor that it's had since American hegemony was established at the end of the Second World War. Many Americans have responded to China's rise, to its sudden sort of surge into our consciousness, very disorienting. In much the same way, I think, as many white Americans responded to the BLM protests, or before that, to the civil rights movement, have responded in a way that is rooted in fear, that it's rooted in a fear of loss of primacy, of privilege. Both responses, I think, involve a fear that many Americans don't even know that they have, but it's one that certain demagogic political leaders have been able to channel very effectively and to amplify and to harness. Just as Trump's presidency and the white ethno-nationalism that it empowered represented a kind of irrational, still representing an irrational response to the loss of white privilege in an increasingly diverse and multicultural United States, so too does Trump's foreign policy, especially his policy toward China, represent an irrational response to a similar loss of American privilege in an increasingly multipolar world. And this is especially true, of course, with regard to China. Zoom out, I think, from the national to the global, and the twilight of white privilege in America looks a lot like the twilight of American hegemony in the world. The armed white nationalists who have grown more vocal and visible in the years since Ferguson find, I think, their analogy in the China hawks who are urging us now into a new Cold War with China. White fragility is American fragility in microcosm. The more that our political leaders, our media elites, our public intellectuals and educators buy into the idea that the Chinese are our enemy, if not now, then surely, an enemy in the making, the more violence against our communities we're going to continue to see. Seeing people in the media and in public life who have fanned the flames of xenophobia by enabling the authors of this radicalized discourse of great power competition, spreading the poison as they have in Chinese as vectors of disease. The Chinese state is ultimately culpable for the tragic losses during the pandemic. Every Chinese person wearing a lab coat is obviously a spy. Anyone working in an engineering department is committing industrial espionage. Every Chinese language instructor is an agent of influence. Seeing these people now acting like they're horrified and shocked by this rise in hate crime, culminating in these cold-blooded murders by this repellent piece of excrement, I am genuinely disgusted. And I have to ask them, what the hell did you think was going to happen? It is not the Chinese people for that. Of course, they're going to say, it's the Chinese Communist Party that they don't like. It's not these other Chinese, Southeast Asian people that are, it's the Chinese Communist Party. Now, I hope by now you have realized that I hate the Chinese Communist Party, but I love the Chinese people is a fig leaf. It's a mere fig leaf. So I think, especially for the people who chant it as a mantra, there might be some who say it in good faith, just as there might be some who say, oh, I have lots of Black friends in good faith, but we know what's up. I mean, we're not stupid. The more they repeat it, the more we know what really lies behind it. People who tell me and others who have drawn attention to this, to the international mention, to tell us that we mustn't point to linkage between xenophobia and hate crime against Asian Americans, because that's a talking point to the Chinese Communist Party. And that, by pointing out this, what to me is an obvious truth, I'm actually carrying water for the Chinese Communist Party, those people are demonstrating exactly the kind of xenophobia that I am talking about, because to see the US as locked in a zero-sum contest with an enemy that's so menacing, a threat that's so existential that it takes precedence over everything in America, our values, the welfare of my community, over the deep-rooted racist pathologies of this country, over the truth, well, that is the very definition of xenophobia. Does this mean that any full-throated criticism of China is simply unacceptable? Absolutely not. Criticize away on any number of issues. God knows that Beijing richly deserves it in many cases, but I would submit that none of the crimes that have been committed against Asian Americans were done out of anger at the treatment of Uyghurs in concentration camps in Xinjiang. None of them were, I mean, nobody is being killed or beaten or insulted because in the name of Hong Kong democracy or in the name of Taiwan's security. No, this is happening because people in this country have stoked the fires of xenophobia. These are often people who really ought to know better, who know this country's history and what people do when their resentments and their fears are directed at the other. They are complicit and they should squarely face the consequences of their complicity in this. This is happening because elites in this country have failed to to fight the dangerous slide that's led to so many people seeing this relationship now through the singular lens of national security. This is happening because too many Americans have unthinkingly accepted a view of China as some kind of existential threat. This is happening because of the neo-McCarthyism of the China initiative launched by the DOJ in 2018, and which this summer was seeing a case opened against a person of Chinese descent every 10 hours. This is happening because of the spread of conspiracy theories about the pandemic's origins that are, by design, easily conflated with even darker theories that impute intentionality to China or are easily conflated with bioweapons theories. I think that we need to understand that xenophobia lies at the heart of it, but this gives me hope because this means that if we change our attitude, all we need to, a lot can change. We can do a lot to pull the fuel out from the fire of xenophobia that is creating this massive horrifying uptick in anti-Asian violence. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kaiser, for sharing your powerful words. Next speaker is Alex Wang. Alex is a professor at the UCLA School of Law. He is a leading expert on environmental law and the law and politics in China. He's worked on issues such as air pollution, climate change, and other environmental issues. Alex.
Great, thanks so much, Michael. Thanks for organizing this event, and thanks to all of you for coming together tonight. I've really enjoyed the comments from all the speakers, and also to see the comments from the audience. I've found many of them very moving and important. Fundamentally, I want to emphasize the overarching message that we're talking about tonight, which is the right of people of Asian descent in America to be recognized not as them, but as us. Right? Not as them, but as us. The vice president earlier used that formulation. I thought it was a powerful formulation and I wanted to raise it here. I teach about Chinese law and politics at the law school here at UCLA, and I wanted to follow up on the angle that Kaiser was taking, but from a slightly different dynamic, to highlight the way that an aspect of US domestic political debates about China have contributed to this framing of all Asians as them rather than us, and contributed to anti-Asian violence. So Donald Trump's insistence on using terms like Kung flu and China virus and Wuhan flu is well known, and the use of that language and other racist language has caused a surge in anti-Asian violence and harassment, right? We know the statistics. We saw hate crimes in major cities going up by 150% last year. Stop AAPI Hate recorded 3,800 anti-Asian incidents of harassment in the last year. And it's worth noting how this sort of incendiary language and also the political attacks on anyone who would criticize the use of that language is an express part of a particular Republican political playbook on China and the COVID crisis. I wanted to remind us of a Republican political strategy memo that was leaked last April in 2020. A so-called Corona Big Book it was a compendium of political talking points on COVID, and it had a few notable features worth reminding ourselves of. One, it recommended as a response to questions to politicians of whether COVID and COVID shutdowns were Trump's fault. The memo said, quote, "Don't defend Trump, attack China." And other key recommendations of the memo were to blame Democrats for being soft on China and to deem as political correctness any criticisms of the use of terms like China virus or Wuhan flu, and to essentially delegitimate those criticisms as political correctness. And so at best, it seemed like the strategy saw anti-Asian harassment and violence that was sure to come as collateral damage in the effort to use China for political advantage. At worst, anti-Asian harassment and violence were actually an express part of the strategy which would go as sort of political dog whistles and overtly racist language would trigger anti-Asian harassment and violence. This in turn would trigger people to push back against the use of that language and other racist statements. And this would allow then the politicians to call the Democrats politically correct, soft on China, or to invoke cancel culture to delegitimate criticisms. And in fact, I was watching yesterday's House Judiciary Committee hearing on anti-Asian violence yesterday in the wake of the Atlanta shootings. And one of the opening statements from Congressman Chip Roy seemed to actually be explicitly implementing the strategy I just mentioned. He, in the midst of a hearing that was meant to talk about anti-Asian violence, he suggested that hearings of that sort were in fact a threat to his free speech and his ability to call China the quote unquote bad guy or deem them the enemy. And in other words, he was implying that Democrats were being politically correct and soft on China. But of course, it's important to separate the political issue as a foreign affairs matter, as an international matter of China and the Communist Party from the issue of inclusion of people of Asian descent on US soil. We know well the tendency toward xenophobia against Asians during times of international conflict. We've seen it against Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, and other Americans of Asian descent. And the risk is growing now as tensions with China increase, as a few of our speakers have already mentioned. And I believe it's possible to deal with these foreign affairs matters, to protect international human rights, to deal with trade conflicts and the like, without stoking racist harassment or violence on US soil. Americans need to be better about this, and they need to find a way to competently deal with these real international conflicts without harming our own people. And this American racist harassment has actually begun to play into these international debates to the extent that there's criticism of China. The Chinese state media has already been using the Atlanta shootings and anti-Asian hate in America as part of its propaganda. Yesterday, the Global Times, a Chinese state media organ, ran an article highlighting Trump's criticism of China and citing it as a source of rising anti-Asian harassment, suggesting it was evidence of American decline and a reason that American legitimacy was declining. So just to conclude, I just want to emphasize again this theme that what we're talking about today is the right of Americans or people of Asian descent in America to have the right to be recognized not as them, but as us. You know, I don't have an easy, uplifting idea for how to solve this, but that concept is a theme that draws together a lot of the concepts that many people don't buy into that very basic idea. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation and thinking of ways to push this country more towards this idea of Asian communities being part of us and not them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. We are going to remain in the world of the UCLA Law School for a moment and introduce Professor Karen Wang, who is Executive Director of the Epstein Program and Professor from Practice at the UCLA Law School. Prior to joining UCLA, Professor Wong advocated for civil rights and immigrant rights for more than 20 years. She is the longtime Vice President of Programs and Communications at Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles and former Director of Advancing Justice LA Immigrants' Rights Project. She is the Deputy Regional Manager, or was the Deputy Regional Manager for the Civil Rights Office of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, launching its Los Angeles office and enforcing federal civil rights across the Southwestern U.S. So I'm sure Professor Wong has a lot to share with us.
Thank you so much, Michael, for having me tonight. And thank you to the Center for Chinese Studies for organizing this. It's an honor to share space with the other thoughtful speakers. But one of the challenges of going towards the end of the long list is I'm probably gonna say ditto or reference what a lot of prior folks said, but hopefully my comments will serve to reinforce, I think, some of the key points that have already been raised. So I wanted to start by saying the Atlanta shootings were they were just a gut punch for me this week. And this was a gut punch that finally really knocked me out. I've been really emotional this week in a way I didn't expect. And this is after going almost numb from months and months of just, these endless reports of harassment and violence showing up in my social media feed and seeing it in the news every time I click on the LA Times or just any publication, this violence directed at Asians and Asian Americans. And, part of the reason it's so emotional for me is that it was another brutal racially motivated killing of an Asian American. Chancellor Block actually mentioned already at the very beginning, Vincent Chin in 1982. It was that specific case that spurred me to go to law school as a young college student. In that case, that young man's death is why I spent more than 20 years working in civil rights advocacy and enforcement, including some of my work dealt with hate crimes cases and other forms of anti-Asian harassment. And it's actually nice to see one of my former colleagues, Hyunju here, who's speaking later from Advancing Justice. I guess in terms of what I had thought to say tonight, I have a lot of thoughts and emotions, but I tried to group some of the things that I've been feeling into two kind of groups of thoughts that are related, that have really kind of risen to the forefront. So first, and I think Professor Nguyen-Vo actually talked about some of my first point, it's really about, particularly with Atlanta, the fact that our legal system is unable or just flat out refuses to understand violence when it is intersectional. So as somebody who worked for a long time kind of tracking hate crimes data, this is actually what I did as a law clerk, and early in my career was looking at hate crimes against Asian Americans. The notable hate crimes cases that have been championed by the Asian American community have centered male victims where gender and sexual orientation have not been quote unquote complicating factors. And so, the more notable ones like Vincent Chin that we already mentioned, if you don't know, he was a Chinese American beaten to death during the rise of the Japanese auto industry, beaten to death in Detroit, which is obviously relevant in 1982. But a couple of other ones that I think are also known for folks who have followed Asian American hate crimes. Joseph Aletto, who was killed here in our own backyard in San Fernando Valley, Filipino American postal worker, shot while he was delivering mail. This is in 1999. And Balbir Singh was a Sikh Indian American man who was murdered, I think, a few days after 9/11, one of the first, but one of many, many victims after 9/11 started sort of an anti-terrorism kind of hate campaign against people who were perceived as being so-called terrorists. And so if you look at all these cases, there are very few women victims who show up in hate crimes data and narratives, even those collected by the Asian American community over the past few decades, because invariably women victims are also sexually harassed or assaulted. It's very hard to untangle those two. And those cases, unfortunately, often get treated as sexual assaults, rapes, as sex crimes, but not as racially driven crimes. And so I remember when I spent like a year researching this in law school, even serial rapists who only attack Asian women, sex crimes motivated by race would fail to be categorized as any sort of racially motivated act or crime. So two things that I think are interesting about this past week that I think give us a chance to think about how we challenge this framing as Asian Americans actually, is that what is the Atlanta shooting on Tuesday? I think some other speakers have already addressed this, but basically law enforcement and mainstream media has reacted so far in fairly predictable ways. They're a prime example, actually, the coverage and the responses this week of the failure to understand violence when it's at the intersection of something like race and gender. So you have 8 people deliberately killed in a series of shootings, 6 of whom are Asian women. They were also all killed at Asian-owned or operated businesses. Atlanta has a proportionately higher percentage of Asians than the rest of the South. I think it's around 12% in Metro Atlanta. But that kind of outcome where 6 out of 8 victims are Asian, that has to be deliberate. That's by choice of the shooter. So you can't say race is not a factor here in some way. Yet law enforcement has pivoted really quickly to the sex aspect of the shootings and appears to be completely discarding race. I actually, shortly before tonight, heard that the FBI is now saying that they don't think race was a factor. This is despite, I think, several speakers, including, I think, Mariana at the beginning referenced the longstanding sexual fetishization of Asian women in both white American history and its imagination. So, that's completely, disregarding the racial aspect of what happened in Atlanta, completely disregards this long and complicated history that our country has with Asia and Asian women. And the second thing I wanted to mention references the data that the other Professor Wang, Alex, mentioned earlier, which is that the group Stop AAPI Hate, just hours before the Atlanta shooting, earlier on Tuesday, actually released its latest data. So what they showed, and this is a group that was formed to track specifically the rise in COVID-related anti-Asian attacks. So they've only been tracking for the past 12 months. And what they showed for the past 12 months was not only that close to 4,000 cases have been reported, and again, these were self-reports just to this one organization that was collecting. But what really stood out to me besides that shocking number was that close to 70%, I think the number is 68% of the cases were reported by women. I think less than 30%, I think it was 29% were reported by men. And that means women were reported 2.3 times more cases than men in these harassment incidents that were happening over the past year. So it's not happening equally, or at least it's not being reported equally in terms of what's been happening in terms of the rise in anti-Asian violence and harassment. So my second point is it's really about, as terrible as the Atlanta shootings and the assaults were, we have to stop focusing on the hate crimes aspect and overall the criminalization aspect of what is happening. And that is, I said at the beginning, what happened in Atlanta was terrible, and I still personally am reeling from it. But the criminal justice system, as Professor Nguyen-Vo mentioned, is likely to fail to recognize the complex racial context of the shootings in Atlanta. So to me, that's one failure of focusing on the criminal justice system as a response to what's happening. Just because the local prosecutor or even the FBI declared that it wasn't about race, I think for Asian American women across the country like me right now, it doesn't make it any less about race just because officially, the criminal investigators aren't going to call it that. But I also wanted to broaden out and say, referring to the 4,000 incidents, what's happening is clearly more than a surge in hate crimes. Hate crimes, someone asked, I think in one of the Q&As, like what's a hate crime versus a hate incident? Hate crimes have to rise to the level of violence, threat of violence, or property damage, so to become criminalized activity that law enforcement can pursue. But if you look at what's been happening, the 4,000 cases that have been documented and the many more that haven't been, there's a sustained surge in anti-Asian activity overall. And the crimes, while they're horrific, are actually small relative in number to the never-ending flood of broader hate incidents. And then I think something like 70% of what Stop AAPI Hate tracked is actually verbal harassment. That's the most common and likely form of anti-Asian violence to happen right now. So the criminal justice system, the legal system, have never really been able to deal with this type of non-criminal harassment and violence. And it doesn't mean that these incidents and violence are going to go away. We now have data to show that it's getting worse, right? So I guess I raise all this because ultimately the criminal justice system and demanding more police and demanding more hate crimes prosecutions is not going to make us safer. The reality is we have all that right now. We have hate crimes laws and penalties that have been on the books for decades. They are not helping. They have not helped. They were meant to deter people, but I don't think there's any documented case of someone who committed a hate crime or didn't commit a hate crime who could say, I didn't do it because I was going to get 10 more years because I was gonna get a hate crimes enhancement. And honestly, calling for more police isn't even helpful to many Asian Americans. Just within the past month, there was a case of a Filipino American in Antioch, Angelo Quinto, who was killed when his family called the police, and instead of helping him, they kneeled on him, very similar to George Floyd, and they killed him. So I wanted to kind of close by saying, you know, I've seen some Asian Americans calling the Atlanta shooting a sort of Vincent Chin moment for our current times, something so palpable to so many that it drives us to action. You know, 40 years ago when Vincent Chin was killed, a lot of the focus was on prosecuting the perpetrators, who were two white men. And that was an era, and the decades that followed that were an era of increasing criminalization, the so-called broken windows policing policies, for example. And what hate crimes laws do essentially is basically enhance the punishment for an existing crime. So you're punished for the underlying crime, like an assault, and then you get additional punishment because the motive was said to be based on a protected category like race. And it was considered a big win at the time for the Chin case to get prosecuted as a hate crime because federal hate crimes laws were fairly new at the time. Vincent Chin was the first Asian victim to be treated as such under the federal laws. But I think as Professor Kim said earlier, you know, we're in a really different place right now in terms of where the country is around criminal justice reform and around what policing and criminal justice really means for communities of color. And so, I mean, what I am hoping, you know, if this is really truly a turning point for Asian Americans, what I hope it causes us to do is to rethink the root causes of hate activity, which is really around racism and white supremacy and powers that uphold racism and white supremacy. And that we think also about centering the trauma and focusing on the trauma that victims experience. Some of the things I'll just mention, because I wanted to say some things that were kind of things we could do is that, you know, Asian Americans can and should be supporting Black Lives Matters. And really, it's not even about BLM, it's about the fact that so many people of color now are mobilizing around a better vision of justice and fighting against, you know, the increasing criminalization of almost every aspect of our society. And I think as Asian Americans, as you know, if you've learned nothing this week, you know, the fact that white police could stand up there and say that, you know, Atlanta had nothing to do with race, you know, with that, they're not on our side. You know, agreeing to be the racial wedge against other communities is not helping Asian Americans at all. And I encourage our community to think about the non-law enforcement options. I'll drop some things into the links, but there are a lot of Asian American leaders who've been organizing around policy recommendations on how to center victim trauma and community services. There are options now in places like LA. I think they're using the 211 number, which has been used for information in the past, but it's also now being used to ask for non-police intervention around hate cases. And I will end by just saying a couple of things. I do think it's absolutely important that we report hate incidents. And by this, I don't mean necessarily to law enforcement, but you know, there are multiple organizations in our community that are collecting this data. This collection of data is what's helping us be able to show the scope of the problem. So Stop AAPI Hate, also Advancing Justice, has the Stand Against Hatred data collection portal, which actually was started in response to then candidate Donald Trump campaigning and starting to use anti-China language when he first started running for president in 2015. And I'll just say, you need to help us document. I mean, everything should be documented because documenting, you know, allows us to tell the stories, but it also helps to validate the experiences of victims. We've had victims realize that they've been harassed by the same perpetrator because people are coming forward and telling their stories. And then finally, I'll just say in terms of what people can do, whether you're Asian or non-Asian, is, you know, one of the challenges that I've seen many Asian Americans express around what's happening is the sense that until 6 Asian women were killed in Atlanta, you know, anti-Asian violence and anti-Asian hate has been viewed as invisible relative to other types of violence in our society. And so standing up for victims of hate incidents is incredibly important. That's, you know, centering the trauma that victims feel, even if it's just verbal harassment, makes the anti-Asian hate visible. As someone who grew up in Indiana and suburban Chicago, I was harassed so often. I was called chink and jap and told to go back to China so many times that it just sort of became like, part of my daily life. Like it was, and it made me feel small and little, and no one ever said anything to me. And I think if someone had just said something, how much earlier I would have been able to kind of, reconcile and deal with that kind of microaggression. And so the last thing I'll say, I'll drop this into the chat again, is that there are bystander intervention trainings. If you haven't heard about this, it's something I urge you to do. The Advancing Justice Organization is partnering with a group called Hollaback, and they're doing these virtual trainings all over. I mean, they're doing them virtually now, but there are organizations all over the country that are sponsoring these. And basically, it teaches you how to safely intervene and support victims and de-escalate conflict. And I think that if nothing, standing up and being able to intervene in a way, even just to tell someone, what happened was terrible, let me be here to support you, is a small thing that we can all do right now going forward.
Thank you so much, Professor Wong. Before I introduce our next speaker, I just want to remind our participants, if you have a question, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can put your questions there, and when we move to the Q&A portion, we'll get to as many of those as possible. I noticed some people are posting questions in the chat forum, and it's easy for us to miss those when we go to Q&A, so you can cut and paste your question from chat to the Q&A if you want them addressed. And again, please identify the speaker that you would like to direct your question to, and also tell us if you are a student. Our next speaker is Dr. Gay Yuan, who is the president of the board of directors at the Chinese American Museum. She has a rich history in community activism. In fact, she just mentioned the other day that she's been interfacing right now with the local Los Angeles government and the mayor's office about the events that are unfolding. She has served in the field of education for over 45 years, has influenced many generations of teachers, principals, lawmakers in her capacity as professor and chair at California State University, Los Angeles. And so I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Yuan.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for enlightening me as I listen to your presentations. I want to address Tiffany and Mariana first. In 1968, I was where you're at. I was an undergraduate at UCLA, and because growing up as an immigrant here in the United States, I had my culture and my language knocked out of me when I was slapped in the face 2 weeks after I landed in the United States, in Los Angeles, and had a self-hatred for years for being Chinese from that point on. And that's what society does to us. And so my saving grace and what influenced me most was being at the right place at the right time and being at UCLA in the late 60s and the early 70s. So I majored in Chinese studies, and I was laughing with Professor Berry today because in fact, he's in the department that I was studying under, but in those days, it was called the Department of Oriental Studies. And so that's what my BA says, that I graduated with a BA in Oriental Studies. But UCLA at that time, and I'm hoping it's true now, was so progressive that it shaped and influenced me in terms of what I did and what I'm doing now. I stood on top of the engineering building as we watched the National Guards marched in a river of hard hats to suppress the anti-Vietnam War protests that we were all involved in. I took my first ethnic studies class at UCLA when no one even knew what ethnic studies was. And we had an Asian American ethnic studies courses and programs. And that was when I realized that, well, I'm not white after all, but then what am I? And that's where the questioning started. What do you do with a BA in Chinese studies? Oh, the parents are saying, go find a job, right? But what do you do with, And then I heard about this thing. Now remember, this was 1973, 74. Lau versus Nichols, Mariana. The law that brought in bilingual education for refugee and immigrant students who couldn't speak English. And that was ushered in because of lawsuits by Chinese families. And if you look throughout history, many of the fights that the Chinese immigrants fought, we fought it in court because that allowed for sustainable change. And we fought by learning the laws. And we fought it in ways that were smart and lasting. But at each stage of US history, we were thrown hurdles. The Chinese Exclusion Act, the miners tax, the poll tax, right? And each time we were able to use our brains to fight our fights. And so when I find myself engaged with the Chinese American Museum of Los Angeles after I retired, after 45 years in education, right, I realize that these are the stories that need to be told. So up until last year, up until 2020, fighting for the sustainability of the Chinese American Museum was difficult, but most of those fights had to do with financial sustainability. What happened in 2020 totally upset our thinking and challenged our thoughts of what is our museum all about. And for those of you who don't know our museum, the Chinese American Museum is located in El Pueblo Historical Monument. We share the space with Olvera Street, and we're across the street from Union Station. People ask, well, how come the Chinese American Museum is not in Chinatown? It is in Chinatown. That was the very first Chinatown. And the museum is in the building that has now been turned back to us by the city government. All the Chinese, and this is something else you might not have known, Mariana. All the Chinese were chased out of Chinatown, of that Chinatown, in the 1930s because they wanted to build Union Station. And so all the families, all the businesses, all the family associations had to move. They were chased out almost overnight. And there are still people living today that remembers playing in the alleys there and growing up there. So going back to what we had to face in terms of the challenge wasn't COVID, because it did close the museum. But the challenge was, what is our museum in terms of our relationship, not only with our Chinese American people, but with the greater society at large? And it's pursuing thoughts of what Helen Zia says frequently, and that is our history and the history of people of color are MIH, missing in history. Nobody talks about us. Nobody talks about our history. And I was shocked, Mariana, when you mentioned the Chinese massacre, when you mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? Recently, at least some of us have heard of Vincent Chin, who was murdered 39 years ago. And we will be commemorating the 40th anniversary next year. But this year is the 150th anniversary of the Chinese massacre. And we're not even a blink. But these are the racist incidents that continues to happen again and again and again. So as a museum who depend on the checks and the checkbooks of our donors and our supporters, we took a very risky step last June, when as a museum, we released a racial justice for all Americans statement calling for unity with the BLM. And we were worried that we would be losing some supporters. But we said we can't only talk about racism in the past without connecting it to the racism that we're facing right now and that we've continued to face from 1850 until now. And so we released that statement. We got some pushback, but mostly we were one of the first Chinese American organizations to come out with that statement, and got a lot of support, not only from our board members, but from our supporters. And yesterday, we released another statement of standing together against hate. Beyond statements, we've been actively working together across coalitions of leaders of people of color, but we've also been working with legislation. We've been working with, in fact, we just met with Police Chief Michael Moore, talking to him about police reform, from training and hiring to promotions, because those are some of the things that need to be changed. And so we're working more on the grassroots level, trying to raise awareness in our own community so that we're not as isolated, and trying to help our community also connect with some of the things that other people of color are facing. And I'm tired, I'm sad, I've also been crying, but we have to do it. We have to roll up our sleeves and do it. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nguyen, for sharing this powerful experience, and even more so for everything that you have done and continue to do. And we really appreciate you sharing your experience. Our final speaker is Hyungju Roh, who is an executive coach and former co-director of Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. She was previously a civil rights attorney and director of various nonprofit organizations. From 2011 to 2014, she was executive director and co-director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice, the nation's first legal aid and civil rights organization serving Asian Pacific American communities. She began her career as a civil rights litigator at the U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division in Washington, D.C. And we're so happy you could join us. Hyungju, please.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you to everyone who shared, and to all the shares in the comments. I've been really moved by a lot of what I've been reading. And I may be the only panelist who Michael didn't actually ask to join this panel. I actually asked him if I could join this panel when I heard that it was happening. And the reason why is actually not because of the past civil rights work that I've done when I used to be an attorney. It's actually because of the work that I'm doing now, which is as somebody who is holding space, in particular for Asian American leaders, and holding space for organizations that are grappling with how do we actually do the work of creating trust and belonging on a day-to-day basis. And so in the spirit of what Michael shared around what are ways up, I wanted to share, and I don't know if my internet connection says it's unstable. Can you still hear me? Michael, can you give me a thumbs up if I'm still coming through? Okay, great, thank you. I wanted to share some thoughts as I've been talking with people this week about what are things that we can do on a day-to-day basis. And The first one really builds so much on what both Gay and Karen shared. And I think of it as choosing to risk our own significance. And this is from one of my favorite poems, and I'm actually going to type the sentence into the chat so that you all have it. But this line has really just been staying with me this week. I choose to risk my significance. And it speaks to what Gay shared around MIH, missing in history. And there are the big history events, of course, right? The big things that are unspoken. And there are also the moments every single day, the moments of choice that we have either to speak up and to share what we're experiencing, to share who we are, or actually not to speak. And these can just be really everyday moments. Like I was in a meeting this morning and we were just doing check-ins, right? And everyone else's check-in, was something like, I'm, experiencing this around my kids and experiencing that. And meanwhile, my heart was just hurting, so the check-in question was, what's present for you now? And what was really present for me was my heart was hurting because of what we've been experiencing this week. And I had this moment of hesitation. Do I share that? Because nobody else is talking about it. Maybe that's not the topic of this conversation. I was the only Asian person in this meeting. And this sentence came back to me. Do I choose to risk my significance? Do I choose to believe that my experience matters? So I did make the choice, and I said, my heart is hurting, and this is why, and this is what is present for me right now. And it changed the course of that conversation. These are the kinds of everyday choices that we can make to risk our own significance, so that we're not MIH in the grand scope of history, and we're also not missing an action in just the everyday moments of our lives. We need each of your voices. We need each of your stories. We need to hear each of you, to see each of you, and just the uniqueness of who you are. That's part of what's going to turn this around, for each of us to share every moment of our lives. The second way up I want to offer is that this, spoiler alert, nobody has the answers. These questions that we are living into right now, questions around how do we care for each other? What does it mean to care for each other? How do we belong to each other? And beyond just sitting at a table together, right? We talk about a seat at the table. I'm not talking about belonging as having a seat at the table. I'm talking about a deeper kind of belonging where your is mine.
You are frozen now, Hyung-Ju.
We don't know how to do this. Everybody is living into these questions right now. And so I want to say that if you don't have the answers, okay, nobody has the answers. Us to actually live into the questions. We are figuring this out in real time. And the final thing I would offer is that discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. Right now, where we are in this country, we're just in a hot mess of discomfort. That's what's real right now. That's what being in community feels like right now. It actually feels like sitting in the discomfort. And each of us has got to build our internal capacity to stay in the discomfort. That's how we stay in community right now. So I want to close with a poem, and it's a poem about building bridges. And I love it because it really speaks to the kind of work that's required of all of us right now. And I'm going to put it in the chat, and I'll read it here as a way to close my share. And this is a poem about building bridges. It's called From Here to There. May I build this bridge between you and me. Build it with words sincere and strong. And when the words don't quite reach, I'll build the bridge with silence. And when silence falls short, I'll build it with longing. And if the longing won't span the gap, I'll fill it in what's left with history, with hope, with facts, with fantasy, jazz, poetry, shoelaces, old gum, feathers, toothpicks, candle wax, gauze of ruined dreams, almosts, apple peels. I swear I will use anything it takes to build this bridge. And when it falls apart, as bridges sometimes do, I will build it again. With my bones, with my tears, with my shadow, with my light. Keep shining your light. We need your light. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Youngju. That was beautiful. And yeah, so much appreciation for all of you for sharing so much beauty and insight and experiences on this panel. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A, but before I open some of those up, one thing that I thought was really special was when Gay was speaking, the interactions you had with Mariana and that kind of intergenerational communication. And before we go to the Q&A box, I'm wondering if any of our speakers have questions for one another, but in particular, the students, do you guys have questions for us old folks, or do any of our speakers have questions for our students? Because I think it's so essential that we also really reach out to one another to understand how our undergrads are coping and navigating what's been happening, and vice versa. And so I want to just create that space for a moment for the panel to interact with one another before we go to the Q&A.
I just had a quick question. Tiffany, did you want to go first, or is it good if I ask really quick?
Yeah, you can go.
Okay, sounds good. I was just going to ask, do you know when the Chinese American Museum will be open, or is COVID affecting that right now?
We're still closed. We're part of Tier 3 opening, but because we're part of El Pueblo Historical Monument, and there are a lot of merchants and food places there, we're dependent on when El Pueblo would open. So we don't have a date yet. And I think, Michael, you and I had talked about, we have resources to bring buses from schools, from kinder to university level, to come visit our museum once it reopens again. And so I'll be happy to provide those to anyone who's interested. And I may personally dose in it.
Thank you. Yeah, we had Alex, Youngju, and I all have children in the same school, and we had a plan to visit Gay's Museum.
I remember.
On the eve of COVID-19, and so we will keep that.
It'll happen. We'll make it happen.
Yes. Other questions for the panel? If not, let's start getting to some of our Q&As. We have so many questions here, and I'm going to start with this one from Julie Cho. What is mainstream news getting right about accounting for the history and context of anti-Asian racism and violence? What do they still need to learn? What can non-English ethnic media sources provide? And how can we elevate this community knowledge? What are some of the media practices that we can use to amplify for better understanding? Anyone? Kaiser, you want to take a stab at that?
I mean, that's a huge question. And I think there have been a lot of critiques about what media has gotten wrong out the gate talking about this. I think that those are fairly familiar. From my perspective, I think that one thing that they have failed to focus enough on is, again, it's, it's, as I said, it's how the downturn in the bilateral relationship coupled with China's meteoric rise has really changed the way that Chinese Americans and collaterally all Asian Americans are viewed in this country. This is something that we've not encountered before. And I think this really needs to be put into an historical context. We've never seen a country rise so quickly relative to us, one that is so deeply intertwined and interdependent with us, where in such a short span of time, they've gone from a country that we very much looked down at, as it were, punched down toward, that was sort of despised, regarded as underdeveloped, regarded as always, the perennial learner, to suddenly one that we in many senses fear. That is something that historically we've not wrestled with before. It's never happened in such a compressed period. And that has, I think, real implications both for how China behaves and for how the United States behaves, and more importantly for our discussion today, how Americans view Chinese, and then of course by extension or collaterally all East Asians in the United States. So I think that's something that the media has missed out on. I think there's after the first 12 hours or so, I saw a lot of pretty heroic efforts to really try to contextualize things. A lot of people who were, boning up as quickly as they could on their Asian American Studies 101. A lot of people who were reaching out as quickly as they could to find people who actually do know the history of Asians in this country. I think that's laudable. I think it should have been there, before the first headlines were, and there were some really execrable headlines. I'll stop there, but I'm sure a lot of people have comments as well.
Would anyone else like to comment on that question? Claire? And then Karen? You're muted, Claire.
I've done a number of media interviews over the last week, so not just about the Atlanta killings, but about previous anti-Asian events. And I have a few observations people might find interesting. Most of the people who contacted me, the reporters, were Asian American themselves. And so I thought this reflected, this interested me because I wondered what difference is it going to make that they're Asian American and how they cover the story. And one thing that disappointed me was that I found that, I understand reporters, especially for like a major newspaper, that they have a deadline in 24 hours, that they don't have a lot of time to do in-depth research. So they reach for whatever interpretive frames are available to us culturally, and they just apply those to the facts on the ground. And so, for example, when there was this brief sort of news frenzy about whether Black people were going after Asian Americans, and I remember one CNN producer contacted me and said, "Can you talk to me about this story?" And I said, well, other than the one video that I saw that might, involve a Black perpetrator in San Francisco, where are the other stories? Like, can you tell me what the evidence is? And she said, well, I don't really know of any others. So it really seemed like it was based on one or two cases. And then people were saying, this is a Black problem, and these are Black people going after Asians. And then all of these, young Asian American journalists wanted to use that frame. And even though I was talking to them and saying, you're criminalizing Black people sort of before there's even been a trial, and in the absence of evidence. So, that concerned me, because here are Asian Americans talking about racism against themselves, and yet they are reproducing, right, these anti-Black tropes, which we know lead to mass incarceration and other nightmares that we are living through. So I thought that was a very interesting aspect of what was going on.
Thank you. Karen?
Yeah, just wanted to, there were a lot of pieces in that question that related to media, and I just wanted to make two comments or observations related to media and what's been happening. One is that, and I think Professor Kim talked about this too, but I have noticed that I think unlike in the past, there are just a lot more Asian American journalists in mainstream spaces, and the stories that I'm seeing that are more nuanced, particularly around the intersectional issues I talked about earlier between race, gender, and sort of the fact that, these may or may not be sex workers. The kind of unpacking of all that is actually coming from Asian American journalists, mostly Asian American women. And so it's just, that representation sometimes feels like, it's like, a low hanging fruit, but it does have this kind of payoff in terms of, I think without them, we would be seeing a lot more of just the, kind of the blind parroting of, what the sheriff said about the bad day and all the horrible kind of, framing around the perpetrator's narrative. So I wanted to lift that up and point to that. And the other piece, I think there was a piece in about ethnic media, and I don't know that my comment will address this, but I also thought it was interesting following what was happening in the reporting is there was a very different set of narratives and facts coming out of Korean media. And I don't read Korean, so this was actually coming from seeing friends that either were Korean speaking or were in Korean communities posting what they were seeing in the Korean media in Atlanta. And the Korean media was identifying who the 4 other victims were sooner. They had facts that have yet to come out, or at least they have witnesses who have said things like there were racialized language being said by the shooter. So there's a lot of things that ethnic media was finding because they were speaking, I think, to witnesses and to the victims' family members, probably in Korean. A lot of, there were, I think, both Korean and Chinese women who were killed. And so the ethnic media has a really powerful role, but they kind of exist in this totally parallel sphere where mainstream media doesn't pay attention to them, and a lot of us who don't speak or read the language also don't. So it's just interesting to me to see how those two pieces might come together, whether the ethnic media did identify facts and other issues that mainstream media hasn't gotten to yet.
Thank you. Gay, did you want to also respond to this? You're muted.
So I'm going to pass on this one and see whether the questions come up.
Okay. Yeah, actually, I'm going to give you the next question then, Gay.
Okay.
This is from Sam Mahara. He says, I'm Sam Mahara, former prisoner at a World War II camp for Japanese Americans. I am now a national lecturer on injustice, including at UCLA. I have taught over 60,000 people across the country, and I have learned that most of the public know very little about racism, hysteria, and leaders allow injustice to take place. My question, how to best educate everyone about the lessons learned from history?
History doesn't come out and say this is racism. We read about wars, we read about events, we read about what one group did to another group, but it really depends on who's telling that story. Because history is really storytelling, especially when we talk about how history is presented in education. And so that's why I think I tend to like the presentation in a storytelling format, because it puts things in context, right? History was my worst topic growing up in the United States. And even though by 4th grade, I learned enough English to function in an all English environment, but it was still struggling with those courses that needed a lot of deep understanding of nuances of what is being communicated to us in the books and also in the so-called lectures and the teachings, right? And so I've always thought I hated history. Never in my life would I have thought that I would be chairman of the board of a historical museum. That was the last thing. If you told me that, 20 years ago, I would have thought that's ridiculous. But I finally realized the reason I hated history was because it didn't apply to me. My folks didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Our westward movement was not in cover wagons, right? Crossing the Rockies. If anything, our second westward movement had to do with the Vietnamese Americans who landed here as refugees, who were sponsored by people from South Dakota. And after the first winter, heard that their relatives in California didn't have to fight through all that snow, right? And so how history is presented, in my mind, is more important after we address the issue of what history is presented. That's a roundabout way of answering the question. And I don't know whether I've answered the question, but you know, please clarify if I have not.
Would anyone else like to take a stab at this question about education? Okay, we will move on. Rachel Lee. Hi, I'm an Asian American high school student from Los Angeles. From what I've seen during this time, a lot of the conversations surrounding the anti-Asian sentiment and racism against Asians in general has been quite insular to the AAPI community. Many of my friends were shocked by the recent Atlanta shooting and the fact that these types of events have been going on during this pandemic. What steps do we need to take for widespread change to be effective, far-reaching, and truly noticed by the greater American public? I mean, this is the million-dollar question, I suppose. Who would like to answer Rachel's question? Anyone? Youngju, you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, Rachel, I was just rereading your question, and it's such a wonderful question. I think it's something that my view is it has to happen on so many different levels, and it requires all of us to be involved because it has to be so multifaceted. So I think one really important step is that each of us starts speaking out in whatever sphere we find ourselves in, right? So whether it's you in your high school, or me in a session that I'm facilitating, you know, or Michael in a class that he's teaching, right? So just imagine the ripple effect if each of us used our voices in that way. And of course, there's the level of policy, right? Really holding our elected officials and our leaders accountable for what we see as the right thing. So just a couple of initial thoughts, and I see some other folks also want to comment.
Does anyone else want to comment? Tiffany?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of things that you can do, and obviously I don't have the answers to all of that, but I think that it's definitely important to, like Hyunju said, to enact change at different levels and at your own like capacity. I think like for me, what I would suggest is maybe even starting at an interpersonal level. Like, what can you do on the daily to challenge, you know, what the violences and the oppression that are occurring? How can you do that in your personal life? Whether that's educating yourself, whether that's spreading awareness on your social media platforms, or talking about them with your friends, your community, your family, all of that. And I would like to say and echo what I had said in the beginning of this event, that this isn't just going to be something that we can resolve after one day, after 1 week, after 1 year. But this is an issue that has been ongoing, and this is something that we have to continue to work together and really consider how we can do this over a span of our lifetime. Because unfortunately, these things have been going on for generations, and it's not going to just take one generation and one person to resolve it.
Gay, is your hand raised also for this question?
It's not, but I do want to say something, and that is, even though I was very traditionally raised, and so it was aspects of having to break out, right, of the Chinese culture, the traditional culture, sometimes values and behavior. And I think so many of us still carry that Asian cultural influence that at this time, we might have to seriously think about how we're going to break out of it. Even something like what Karen Wang said about underreporting, right? Underreporting of hate crimes and hate incidents. And then how, for those who report, it's the women who report. And so the assumption is that more violence has been perpetrated against women than men. And then Karen corrected herself and said, well, at least not as reported, right? And so if you look at our culture and you think about male-female relationships within the so-called Confucius cultures or the Asian values and the Asian influences, that male might be less likely to report an incident than the woman might, right? And so the other thing we talked about, I belong to a very small coalition of like-minded people, and we talk every Wednesday morning. And finally, one of the women said, you know, I think we need to go against our, our grain and not keep doing what we've been conditioned or taught to do. We have to speak up, we have to report, we have to talk back. And we need to talk back even though we're afraid of repercussions, right? And I think she's right on. I think the time is now. This is the time for change. But this is also the time to change our behavior. I have this internal struggle. On one hand, I really love and value traditional Chinese, right, values and teaching. But growing up as a victim of so many racial incidents, I had to learn to fight back. And I fight back by speaking louder, by demanding more, right? By squeaking, right? Being that squeaking wheel to position myself to be where I am today in terms of the type of work that I do that is important to me. So that's the dilemma of pride in self and pride in background versus what we have to do to exist in a society that is racist and is always trying to knock us down. And so that's the dilemma that I think we're all struggling with.
Thank you, Gay. Also in response to Rachel's question, I want to add, don't underestimate the kind of the butterfly effect of small actions and how they can reverberate and exact change. And I'm going to give a tiny example, which is on Wednesday night, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the event, Wednesday night, Wang Yo, our PhD student, sent me an email. That's it. And tonight there's 500 people in a room discussing these issues. And who knows what something that Gay said or something that Thu-Huong said or something that Hyungju said is going to resonate with one of those listeners, and they're going to impact people and their lives. And I think that's all we can do. And you never know where it's going to go, but we push forward. And I mentioned Wang Yo because she gifted us with a question. And so and we wouldn't be here without Wang Yo. So I'm going to read Wang Yo's question. Thank you so much for your insights. As an international student, I'd also like to hear more about your insights on how to integrate international students and other non-citizens in the conversations largely discussed in a domestic setting. Do you have any suggestions? What should we do to have the university and the larger system care and protect about our safety and basic human rights, in addition to treating us as a cash cow that provides non-residential tuition? Facing harassment or violence, we often lack the sophisticated community, supportive network in our home country, or the education or training about how to address the frustration and speak up in an alien context. In the issue of PRC citizens, the new Cold War threat and visa issues also add another level of vulnerability. Wondering maybe Thu-Huong or Alex, who would like to try to respond to Wang Yo's question?
Well, I think, definitely we have to talk about this transnational dimension that he mentioned earlier, and a lot of the speakers have also mentioned as well. Not necessarily the international dimension, but this sort of like, the connections that cuts across the different geopolitical interests and the kind of, historically formed racial taxonomies that happens in the US. So in those kinds of conversations, I think international students will have more contribution to make, and also to, from their insights, we can make these connections like across history as well, right? That there's this long history of racialization through the colonial periods, or even prior to the European colonial period, there were like different modes of racialization. We can talk about that, and then we can talk about like European modes of racialization, and then the American modes of racialization after World War II, taking advantage of the discourse of national self-determination and the promotion of like nationalism, and how competing nationalisms now in Asia, have an impact on our communities today, and how then within the community, when we can talk about, incidents of white supremacist violence. And so there's like so many points of connections that international students can enlighten us on, and we can forge more of those connections. As far as like the institutional practices to make international students' needs more visible, I think definitely we need to do that. And until we do away with this idea that the US is somehow the center of the production of knowledge and other people have to come here to learn from us, rather than the other way around, then international students will remain less than visible, and their needs will remain less than visible within institutions like UCLA.
Yeah, Michael, I can chime in a little bit. I mean, I think it's so important to have the international students participate actively in campus life and in these difficult discussions. We had an incident last year at the law school where one of my colleagues tweeted that he thought he might have gotten COVID from some of the Chinese students in his class, and it caused a whole hubbub that I wasn't leading the response to it, but I was pulled into a lot of the conversations. And there's no easy answer to that. I saw that Luttrell had referenced that incident, and I can say that when that incident came out, I was really happy to see that a number of the Chinese international students stepped in student leadership roles to participate in the discussion and to speak very eloquently about how they responded to those comments, and in small group conversations directly with the professor. And I was really proud of them for speaking out and having a voice. And one of the things the dean did was to have someone spoke at the graduation and referenced these issues. And so again, there's no easy answer, but it's part of being part of a community and engaging. And it relates to some of the things that other people have said about just trying to fight maybe urges just to let something go or to keep something quiet or for whatever reason it is, right? And at least at the law school, I've seen a lot of the Chinese students are quite interested in getting into the fray. I have a difficult challenge in teaching my classes about Chinese law and politics. I'm a sort of liberal Democrat, and I have a lot of criticisms of what the Chinese party is doing. Yet I also recognize the historical dynamics, the colonial dynamics, the way that race plays into discussions about US and China, and hierarchies of who's better and who's worse and who's more primitive and these sorts of things. And it's a difficult discussion. I'm glad that also that a number of international Chinese students have gotten into have attended my class and engaged in those difficult discussions. And that's been incredibly important for the American students to learn from that and to hear different perspectives that can be very, dramatically different from what you read in the New York Times or Western media. And I think we're all the better for grappling with it. It's not like any easy answers emerge from these classes, but I think we are all the better for understanding the complexities of the situation. And so, I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but I think, you yourself have shown an initiative, as Michael mentioned, in even, being the sort of inspiration for this event that we have today. And so, you've played a tremendous role in that dialogue. So just, if we can all sort of learn from that and keep doing that and keep doing more of that, I think that that's part of the answer.
Thank you. We have I'm going to have a double header question for Professor Kim, if that's okay. The first part, while the past week, month, year have understandably left our communities shaken and in pain, based on your longtime work, can you remind us about the ways we might stay focused on the relational histories of minoritized groups so that we might resist the urge to singularize or dehistoricize recent events? And a second question from, let me see. I hope Dr. Claire Jean Kim speaks about her upcoming book that reconsiders the way that Asian American history has tended to focus on the white Asian binary, but places our experience in the context of fundamental anti-Blackness. Could you maybe riff on those two questions?
So thank you for the questions. Yeah, the first question, the temptation is always to singularize, as you mentioned, and to sort of close ranks and circle the wagons and talk about what's specific about Asian Americans' experiences. And so that's why in my comments I said it's so important for us to always be thinking relationally and asking, how does what's happening to us in terms of violence relate to the ongoing structural violence against Black people that is part of our inheritance, our living inheritance of being a society that was built upon slavery. So I think that the important thing is to think about how either a lot of the stories on anti-Asian violence don't mention anti-Black violence at all, or they quote Asian American leaders and thinkers saying, well, we stand in solidarity with Black people. So I wanted to push the conversation just one step further than that. And I know this is uncomfortable and it might actually make people, a little uneasy. And I understand that, but I just wanted to sort of leave this with you to think about. And that is the question is, if it's not, is it enough to say we stand in solidarity with Black people? Or is there actually an ethical imperative for Asian Americans to talk about the ways in which we are structurally advantaged relative to Black people? I mean, I'm finishing up with like a 500-page book that looks back, this is getting to the second question, at Asian American history through the lens of structural anti-Blackness and says, how can we reread Asian American history in relation to anti-Blackness? And one of the things I find, over and over again is this structural gap between Asians and Black people that shows up over and over again. And the way that we talk about people of color, the way that we talk about the third world in the 60s, covers up, right, that gap. So if we look at that gap honestly as Asian Americans, how might that shape the way that we're responding to anti-Asian violence? Because I think it's so important at this moment, like I said, when it's sort of the hardest to think about our relationship to Black Lives Matter and beyond Black Lives Matter to the Black freedom struggle generally.
Thank you. This is a question for Kaiser. I concurred with Kaiser Kuo's analysis of the psychological groundings for how Americans think about China and Chinese people. Acknowledging it is the first step. However, we know that in DEI training, taking an accusatory tactic does not work. How might we help move the Americans on the street and in the elite circles from being fearful to being optimistic about a multipolar world and a multicultural US society?
Well, I'm not sure what the training he referred to means, but I do think that some level of confrontation is unavoidable and necessary. I think that, you know, look, people didn't, we didn't see attitudes shift dramatically, I think, this summer toward BLM because, you know, people were engaging with their neighbors peaceably and only just trying to solicit empathy. I think that there was pretty radical confrontation, and I think that's sometimes necessary. Now, in this case, I honestly think that this lends itself to a pretty good solution. There are people who we can identify who are the influencers when it comes to how the United States thinks about its relationship with other countries, especially with China. And I think those are the people that need simply to be worked on to be, and the really kind of the perpetrators, the people who are carrying water for the Matt Pottingers and the Mike Pompeos of the world, who are actually publishing books, for example, based on that, you know, to who have actively spread, you know, columnists for example, a newspaper that whose name rhymes with Squashing Fun Post or something like that. They are absolutely guilty of spreading this kind of stuff. And I think I'm not above. I want to deplatform these people. I want to call them out. I want to make them face their complicity in what's happened. I don't buy the idea that confrontation and, you know, an accusatory tone doesn't work.
Thank you. I see we have actually moved past our original end time already, but we still have 340 people in the room and a lot of questions. If any of our speakers need to leave, of course, you're welcome to sneak out. But if you don't mind, I think we'll answer a few more questions if everyone is agreeable to that. And so this is one for Dr. Nguyen. I'm glad you mentioned about self-hatred. I think the hardest thing is to face your own prejudice from being Asian. I started to come to this kind of a face after a long time of avoiding it. I appreciate any advice you have for me in overcoming the self-hatred and celebrating our heritage. You're muted, I think.
That's going to be a phrase that grows out of this pandemic is, you're muted. You know, in education, we talk a lot about positive reinforcement and how we need to look at the affective growth in addition to cognitive growth, whether it's a child or a human being of any age. And when society out there continues to negative reinforce who you are, what you look like, how you speak, and even what you eat, right? When this constant negativism keeps bombarding you from infancy to adulthood, you can't help but hate yourself. I still remember before my awakening at UCLA, it's hard enough to be a teenager, right? With peer pressure, you want to dress like everybody else, look like everybody else. And I'm a very frank, disclosing person, so I'm going to say, I went to high school in a Jewish all-white area in Las Vegas. I remember, and excuse me, gentlemen, I remember stuffing tissue in my bra and cutting up tape, Scotch tape, to put on my eyelids so I would have that double eyelid look, just so I would be beautiful, because beauty was defined by what I saw on TV and what I saw in magazines and what I saw in books. when I became a teacher, I purposefully tried to be inclusive of what my students heard and what my students saw, to the very simple aspect of what we eat and what was taught to us in the fruit groups. Remember the fruit groups? Now it's a pyramid, right? But in my days, I remember being 6 years old, 7 years old, being taught fruit groups. And in those days, there was dairy, meat, vegetables, and sugar, right? And so milk, well, we didn't drink milk at home. And then the meat was hamburgers, hot dogs, and steak. The vegetables were iceberg lettuce, corn, and peas. I didn't eat that stuff. And the story I tell is, I'm sure I had a wonderful teacher. And in those days, we didn't have styrofoam, okay? So for homework, the teacher gave each of us a paper plate. And as a teacher, I think that was a wonderful creative assignment. We took our paper plate home, and the assignment was to draw our dinner on the plate. I went home, good Chinese girl, I always did my homework. Sat down on the dinner table with grandma, grandpa, mom, and dad. I was an only child. You can tell I'm an only child. And I looked at my plate and I looked at our place settings. How do we eat? A bowl of rice in front of us with chopsticks, and then the communal plates of dishes. Well, gosh, not only were we weird, we don't even eat correctly. So I took my bowl of rice and I dumped it I went to the kitchen, got a platter. That was the biggest thing that looked like a plate. I dumped it on the platter. I took the broccoli and beef or whatever it was, and I dumped it on my platter, and I separated the vegetables from the meat. And I never sat down at the dinner table to eat with my parents again for 3 years. I was so ashamed that we did not eat correctly.
Oh,
right.
That is heartbreaking.
I cry every time I tell that story. But the point of the story is, when I got that teaching credential from UCLA, and when I became a first grade teacher at the same elementary school that I got slapped in the face with, okay, I made sure every time I taught the food groups, I included tofu, I included bok choy, I included tortillas, because we had a mixed Latin group there. We need to be included, and we need to teach that we are beautiful. And that's why I believe so much in education, because I believe. And just that little thing can make such a big difference.
Thank you, Gay. Hyungju, did you want to add to this?
Two short things. One is that you're already, and I can't find the original question. What was the name of the person who asked the question? But for the person who asked the question, you're already taking the first step, which is just to see the impact on your life, right? And to see the pain that it's causing in your life. And I mean, and oh, Reina, thank you. And I think for me, when I actually saw the impact of the self-hatred and the shame, right? There was a point at which there was something inside me that just said, no, I'm not going to live like this. This isn't okay. And so part of it is just connecting with that part of yourself that knows this is not okay. This is not how I'm meant to be in the world. And what I would also say is just surround yourself with people and with resources and with anything that just connects you and reminds you of your own beauty and your own worth. And it doesn't even just have to be from the Asian American community. Some of the most inspiring sources for me have been from Black women, right? I mean, other people who've gone through the same journeys that we have. Just surround yourself, like change your sense of what reality is.
Thank you. Thank you. In the room, we've got quite a few lawyers or former lawyers and law school professors, and we have a few questions for this group. So one of them is from Bai-Ching Zhang. Thank you for the talks for Professor Karen Wang and Alex Wang. Other than law enforcement and policymakers, what other channels can be used to address hate crime and incidents, verbal and other forms of hurt? And a question from Susan Lee writes, directed to the lawyers or anyone who can answer this, is there a way to change our criminal justice system so that it will recognize violence when it is intersectional? It hurts not to have this acknowledgement and not to have a criminal justice system that is fair. What they say publicly in many ways perpetuates all of the problems we are talking about this evening. Karen, do you want to start?
Karen, do you want to take?
Sure. I feel like I'm being tagged here by everyone. Okay. I will. So a couple pieces. I think the first question was around, how to address hate crimes and hate incidents. I mean, I guess I would go back to what I said earlier, which is I absolutely think that incidents that happen, whether or not they rise to the level of crime, I think especially if they don't, need to be reported to the community groups that are actively monitoring. There's not a one centralized source, and I can drop it again, but there's at least two groups actively collecting. One is the Stand Against Hatred website, which launched in 2017, and then Stop AAPI Hate, which launched last year. But both are collecting anecdotes. They actually take reports in non-English languages. So you can do it in a number of Asian languages for first generation immigrants. And I think just reporting it really, helps to validate the experience of the people who suffer the trauma. It helps community advocates and activists gather the data to be able to make the case for different types of responses. I mean, I think we're still in a system where, if someone is harmed or suffers significant property damage and wants to report it as a crime, that's when to report it to law enforcement. It's just, the Anthony Quinto case out of Northern California, where the Filipino man was killed by the police who his parents called when he was having a mental health crisis, I think is a cautionary tale for us. I think as a community, as immigrants, we kind of taught not to rock the boat and trust the police. And, the police is part of a larger institution that is not necessarily here to protect and preserve us unless it benefits those in power, which tend to be those who are white, not people like us. So, I mean, my main point is that if something happens, particularly the hate incidents that many people are experiencing on a daily basis, those should be reported, because until people do, we're not able to speak up and demand changes, either in policing or even in media coverage, right? So that's one piece. I think on the intersectional piece, I mean, honestly, the issue is probably not so much with data collection. I think the forums can collect data on the fact that it's a crime that's motivated by more than one thing. I mean, that's to me not the issue. It's the issue that as a society, other than the people who embrace things like critical race theory, a lot of people just don't believe that we can exist at intersections, right? So if you're a woman, then you're experiencing, gender issues. But if you're an Asian woman, you're either experiencing Asian or gender or sex-related issues. It's hard for people to grasp. It could be both. And this is the same for folks who identify as queer, for example. I think anti-gay crimes against people of color also have the same problem, where they're not categorized usually correctly as both. So I think it's a larger institutional piece of training those who are responsible for collecting data for dealing with these issues, as opposed to something as simple as, how do we collect the data? So these go to larger issues. We've been talking about all night about education, about changing how we think about things versus kind of simpler solutions, such as can we change a form or can we mandate the police do X and Y? I'm not sure I have actually answered the question, and I actually feel like I spoke about this in my comments, so would welcome hearing from others on the panel.
Alex?
Yeah, I don't know if I really have anything to add to that. I mean, I'm not a criminal law specialist, but even though I'm in the law school, I do feel like on the criminal side, Karen's highlighted very well some of the the shortcomings of the criminal law system, and also the shifting attitudes towards criminalization of things. And so, it makes me want to highlight the non-legal methods of addressing this, shining a light on things, making sure we build community and work to sort of fight against this in informal ways as well. So.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, well, maybe we'll take another 10 minutes or so and then start to wrap up. Does that sound like a good plan, panelists? So this is a question from Ashley. I'm a second generation Chinese Canadian. I graduated from UCLA in 2020. My question is, are there any sources that can help me understand how anti-Asian racism exists at an everyday level? I read Kathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings, and I think it was the first time I started seeing how racism doesn't have to be as explicit as a racial slur to be considered racism. I think having more everyday examples would really help me show that to my Canadian loved ones that anti-Asian racism isn't a thing of the past and it isn't just an American issue. Perhaps it's because my friends are middle class, Chinese from a country, Canada, that explicitly promotes multiculturalism, and or from a city like Vancouver where many Asians, where there are many Asians, but some of my Asian loved ones seem to question the existence of anti-Asian racism today. Who would like to address Ashley's question? Thu-Huong? Or maybe our students, Tiffany, Mariana, do you have anything? What would you say to Ashley?
I can just add really quickly, kind of like what I was saying in the beginning, but just about how this is more about just how commonplace it is than maybe people you talk to personally. But I studied this before in high school and other college classes, but there was a really good Instagram post. Actually, I think I'm kind of critical of social media sometimes, but I think it's actually a really helpful tool when it's used correctly. So I can put the username in the chat later. But this account pretty much really efficiently broke down just how harmfully Hollywood specifically, but other film companies too, portray Asian Americans and Asian people. And I think people don't realize how deeply ingrained it is. And I can just walk through some of the examples pretty quickly, but one of my least favorite, I think one of the most harmful stereotypes ever is in Full Metal Jacket and the whole "me love you long time, me so horny." And that one I think is so deeply ingrained that I would say like maybe bi-weekly I see a non-Asian person with good intentions. I don't think at all that they even knew where it came from. I think it's just so deeply embedded in US society that they just say "love you long time" or "love you long time" when it's someone's birthday, or they're shouting someone out. And the scary part is they're not saying it to be racist, and they probably didn't even see the film, but it's just so into our lexicon is the way we talk in the US that it represents just how commonplace it is and how casual it is and how flippant some of these harmful comments and stereotypes can be made that have real repercussions. Like look at the shooting of these Asian women and how they were hypersexualized and objectified and not seen as complex human beings with their own emotions. So I think it could seem trivial on surface level to look at maybe like pop culture instead of, I don't know, like something in real life with people you talk to interpersonally, but just examples like that. I mean, even going back to Piccadilly with Wang in 1929, this goes back almost a century in Hollywood film of just not only Asian women being sexualized, but also seen, and the same thing with Mean Girls too, just disposable sex objects and home wreckers and causing harm and disruption to the plot rather than furthering it along. Or Austin Powers of checking off Japanese twins threesomes as just sexualizing like a bucket list. There's a lot of movies that do that one. And Amy Schumer too, and Kung Fu Vagina and things like that, that just reduce Asian women to the size of their genitalia. And it's just really harmful. So I think even looking places like that. And a lot of those movies too, I have a conflicting relationship because I like them for their cinematic aspects or for their storytelling or what it was in my childhood. But I can also at the same time critique it and see what it's perpetuating. And some of them, it's easy to say, oh, that was in the 1920s. That was so long ago. We're more evolved now. But I feel like even things like Amy Schumer's Routine or Mean Girls are so recent and so maybe under evaluated that I think that offers a really interesting place to look. And it's, I mean, they're on the screen. So I feel like that's a good place to analyze for just how commonplace it is.
Would anyone else like to add to that? If not, there are a lot more questions, but the questions we'll never answer all of them, right? And we'll never solve this problem in one place. This is part of an ongoing conversation. And I'm so thankful that we had the conversation, and we hopefully will. This is just the tip of the iceberg. We'll continue this. I'm sure on campus there will be more events, more dialogues, and I'm sure all of us will keep taking actions in our everyday lives to try to change the temperature and change how things are. I'd like to close by maybe going around the room. And I know I asked everybody to think about it, and some of you did that presentation. Dark time.
You're frozen, Michael. I don't know if you.
We lost Michael. He had asked me to be a backup moderator in case this happened. So we made it through almost the entire time without this happening. So it sounded like he was going to ask us to all make a closing statement. I don't know if you had anything in particular in mind, but maybe just everyone give some thought for maybe a 30 seconds of something that you might say to wrap things up at the end. Michael, can you hear us again?
Back, so I'll just say it quickly. I was hoping to close by going around the room and having everybody share maybe a word, a sentence, an action, but some way forward. It
was less than 30 seconds. I thought you were going to say 30 seconds.
Dad, you're frozen.
Okay. Word or a sentence.
Yeah, but if everybody could share some experience or advice. Basically, I think a lot of people are hurting right now, and a lot of people are in a dark place, and whatever gift you can give them in words to close the evening with a little bit of light, a little bit of brightness, I think everyone will appreciate that.
I can go. I do have something bright. There's a book I highly recommend. It's written by the former China director at the National Security Council during the second Obama administration. He is a true mensch, somebody who was a career foreign service officer. His name is Ryan Hass, Hass. His book is called Stronger, and it's about recalibrating U.S.-China relations in an age of competitive interdependence. There it is, right there. I cannot recommend this book more highly. It will actually give you hope that it is possible to navigate what looks like an impossible relationship, and that will redound to relations in the United States between Asian Americans and others.
Okay.
I think we have to keep reminding ourselves that our stories are important. And I go back to that modesty that's ingrained in us. And I actually came onto this panel with a lot of fear because I was just texting my friend. I go, oh my God, these are all scholars and they're writers and they publish so many books and they speak so well and they're so important and they're so articulate. And we need to take a big breath and say, well, my story is important too. And if I don't tell it, no one's going to hear it. So I'm going to have to share it. So I think each of us will have to share our stories because our stories will make an impact.
Thank you. Karen?
So I've been reading a ton of just thought pieces, I think mostly from Asian Americans this past week, really just the last few days. And a couple of the comments that really stood out to me. One is from, I don't actually know this person, I think she might be a professor, Kyung Kang at Seattle University, in an op-ed in Seattle Times. There was a sentence that stood out to me that said, the most potent weapon of anti-Asian racism is erasure of our voice, our presence, our humanity. It shouldn't take a mass murder to take notice. And I guess to kind of pivot it, because you asked us to close on an uplifting note, Michael, is, I mean, that is, what happened already this week on Tuesday. We lost, 8 lives, 6 were Asian American women, and we need to make sure that we, use this moment to really kind of become less invisible. I think Kathy Park Hong, another writer, also wrote recently. I think this theme of invisibility keeps coming up amongst a lot of Asian American writers who've been saying, we suddenly feel seen, even if it's just for a moment. And so I do think we both need to use it to lift up sort of the pain and the trauma of our communities, but at the same time, to what many of the other speakers, including Professor Kim, who left already, said, we need to use this moment also to build solidarity with Black and other communities to kind of address the larger issues that are causing anti-Asian violence. So, let's not be invisible, but let's also, use our visibility in a powerful and kind of cohesive way.
Thank you. Thu-Huong?
I am still, the words that Hun-Ju gave us with the poem are still ringing in my head. And they're just so beautiful. In terms of it sort of reinforces what I was thinking about, the kind of performative actions that we can engage in, or the kind of more substantive structural actions that we can engage in. The performative, some of the performative acts on social media that I saw was posting the yellow square, or having these boxes to teach people that we don't eat dogs. I think those are not very effective, or they're not, not only are they not effective, they're sort of are not showing the sort of, the issue that Claire talked about earlier, which is the interconnectedness and the relational character of how we are being racialized against one another from different racialized communities. So, the bridge, this image of the bridge, and how to reach out and have a lot of conversations with other racialized communities, African American communities, Latinx communities, other Native American communities, that we can reach out in whatever way that we can through social media or any other kind of platform to have these kinds of conversations, I think would be very necessary at this particular moment.
Thank you. Alex?
I would say I spoke about the way that I think the insidious politics of race in China. And I would say, this is not uplifting at all, but we all should do what we can to create a political cost for dog whistling on race in politics, or even using race more overtly in the way that it's being used. Thank goodness we're out of the Trump era, where it was almost a daily occurrence that we were getting these types of things in our news and our inboxes. But obviously that strategy is still ongoing. It's still thought to be a powerful and useful strategy by many in many quarters. And so we can't, there may be a tendency to feel fatigue and to just say, look, that's just politics. But I think it's our job as citizens to just make it costly, make it a problem for politicians to do that every day and at every moment that we can.
Thank you. Kyung-Ju?
Gift that I would like to offer everyone is the gift that I've received from this event, which is the gift of not being alone. And when I think back to this week and the times that I've felt that difficulty of being visible, right, or of using my voice, I think what's felt really hard during those moments has just been this feeling of being alone. And I noticed just being here with all of you, I mean, actually having this conversation, sharing our experiences, I feel stronger. I feel more capable. I feel that I'm not using my voice on my own. And so I guess the gift, or what I would offer, is just keep talking to each other. Let's keep talking to each other. Let's keep kind of strengthening each other.
Thank you, Hyungju. We began with our students, and I'm going to close with our students. I saved them for last, but I also wanted to add my gift. And I have to say that I feel that our generation and every generation before us has failed in big ways when it comes to these issues of race. And I put a lot of hope and faith on the younger generation. And I, with my own children, I remember when George Floyd was murdered, you know, they were, you know, they're small, they're 10 and under. And I had them draw a portrait of George Floyd and write a letter to him. And it was that process of, I mean, you see news, you see a photo of someone like that, but it's different when you draw them and you really look at the texture of the skin and their eyes and their spirit and their lips, and you get a different sense of someone. And we all sat around the table and we all drew him, and then my kids wrote letters to him, and doing those kind of activities so that hopefully this next generation will get it right, because certainly we've been failing. And part of that next generation, we have here Tiffany and Mariana, and I want to give both of you a chance to, you know, to close the night with your wisdom and reflections. Mariana, you want to start?
Okay, I feel like it's probably better if I go before Tiffany because she's been so eloquent. But I really like that idea of that your kids drew George Floyd. I don't think anyone I know did that with their kids. I think a strategy was maybe picking books that are easy to comprehend for young people that include more characters of color, kind of going back to the film thing of just characters that are more dynamic, not tokens, not arbitrarily just assigned a race for some random reason, but actually contribute something to the story and don't need to be Asian or don't need to be Black or whatever, just a person. So I feel like that's really good for the youth, and just also kind of like what I was saying earlier too, of just not being afraid to use social media as a tool when it's helpful too, because I do kind of give social media a bad rap sometimes just because of how sometimes it gets misused, or sometimes it's not the most effective long term. But I think it's actually a really good tool. For example, I've been able to use it this past month to be able to share resources to alternatives to calling the police, or specific cases. Unfortunately, most of them have been about Christian Hall or Anthony Quinto, because the women are underreported. But just being able to share what I'm able to share, or share resources, or just how to contact or send an email to the White House and things like that, that I feel like without social media, I wouldn't have a tool to reach hundreds of people instantly with just the click of a phone. So I feel like, I just feel like that's a really good tool if it's used correctly. So yeah, I think I would end on that of just, sometimes like the younger generation can get kind of like, sometimes they're fun to make fun of for things like that, but I feel like it actually is really a good tool to mobilize. And just going back to the film and music and art and anything like that, of non-scholarly work too, of just everyday material. I think that's just a really good idea to include more characters and more authors of color in your bookshelf and your movie shelf and your music.
Thank you, Mariana. Tiffany?
So much pressure to be the last person to talk. I feel like there's so much I want to say, but also so much that I like don't know how to say. So it's very funny to me that Mariana says that I sound very eloquent. I did want to echo what Dr. Nguyen said in the beginning. I was very nervous being part of this panel because I'm just, at least for me, so I'm just a student. I don't know everything. I don't have all the answers. I felt like I wouldn't have much to contribute, but I feel like that belief and that doubt really holds me back. And that was what I was trying to stray away from, and what I'm working and striving towards to be better at moving forward. And I think what I do want to leave with everyone is that I wanted to remind everyone that everyone here has the capacity to enact change. And no matter if you are a child or a student, a professor, scholar, any insight that you have, any narrative, any action that you take to support your community and to support yourself is definitely really, really important. And at this time, it's definitely really hard. And I know we're going through a lot of different emotions in response to all of these events and issues, but just know that you're not alone, like what Hyunju said. This discomfort is here to push us towards, greater paths, and that I'm just very grateful to be part of this space and really grateful for all of you. And I truly hope that we can continue to work towards change, to build solidarity amongst our different communities, and just continue to heal as people of color.
Thank you, Tiffany. And thanks to all of our panelists for spending these 2.5 hours with us, and our audience members at various platforms. We appreciate you joining us, and I'm very thankful just to be a listener and to learn from everyone. And Karen, your center co-sponsored this event. Thank you for your support, and all the other centers and programs on campus that supported us, and especially our chancellor's office, who delivered opening remarks. We appreciate that the highest levels of the administration hears what's happening, and we look forward to a brighter day ahead, and we will continue to fight. And thank you all so much.